Welcome to this episode of Fish Files, and we're going to go over one of the largest families of fish that you're going to find in your typical aquarium fish store, and that family of fish is called catfish, the order Siluriformes. Siluriformes. Anyways, that's about scientific as we're going to get, because catfish normally have scientific names that are super long, and I'm not going to memorize every single one of these things I'm going to show, but the common names are easy. We're going to go over the ones from each region of the world. As you'll see, most of them do come from South America. There's 3,000 total catfish species in the world. They're not defined by the barbs and whiskers, the long tails. They're actually defined zoologically because they have a weird structure in their head and an organ in their head, and that's why they're called catfish, because obviously barbs have barbs. But catfish, when you see a catfish, you know a catfish in the aquarium store. And by the time we get through this episode, you're going to know them all too. And I want to start with Africa. Africa catfish are in the Synodontis catfish family. There's approximately 40 that you can find around the trade. To this day, most of them hybridized from Florida. You used to have some really neat straight Synodontis multifasciatus from Africa, Synodontis angelica, Synodontis decoris. Now when you find those in the pet store, most of the time they're hybridized with more common species. It makes them easier to breed and makes them more hardy for the conditions they have to grow in a pond in Florida. But they're still very pretty catfish. Just a quick note on this episode of Catfish. I'll get all kinds of comments that you didn't show this cory or this pleco. Each one of those families is 150 different plecos. Most of them in the aquarium trade. There's 170 cories, most of them in the aquarium trade. Those have their own episodes. These are the catfish other than those two families that you can find in the aquarium store. Codonas Petricola are a fairly common catfish, but difficult to breed, so they're a bit expensive. Typically they'll be $24, $25 in the aquarium store, maybe up to $30. I don't want to take any money out of the aquarium store's pocket. These guys, like I said, are juvenile. I call that 3/4 of an inch. Typically that's the kind of size you're going to see when you first bring them in wholesale and sell them to the stores. They will grow to about 4 inches max. So they're a really good aquarium catfish. They will not outgrow the tank. They're generally peaceful. The bigger they grow, like nearly all catfish, they're omnivorous, and they are going to put anything that can fit in their mouth to see if it's edible. Unfortunately, as they get to 2 inches and more, fancy shrimp and similar small species like that, you got to avoid. Maybe even at 4 inches, you might even have to avoid things like pygmy corydoras. So that's the Synodontis Petricola. I want to mention, watch those barbs. When you deal with catfish, there's a couple, particularly corydoras, pictus catfish, and those Synodontis have venom at the end of their barbs. It's not going to kill you, but it's going to feel not like a bee sting, but like maybe a third of the way up there. So you don't want to get stung by their little barbs. They don't try and sting you with them, it's just that they're difficult to handle. So be careful handling them. Try and just use the whole net. Don't try and grab them to push them out. Use coarse nets, don't use fine nets. Coarse nets actually snag the fish less than the fine nets. So personally, in our wholesale warehouse, we avoid fine nets. Now moving on to the next, this is a bread and butter catfish for every single pet store, and pet stores, call me up if you don't have one in your tanks, but this is called the upside down catfish, and they are a Synodontis. All Synodontis can swim upside down, backwards. These guys are, we call them like the false upside down catfish. They're Synodontis eupterus. The actual Synodontis nigraventus is the upside down catfish. I chose these because they have a really pretty pattern. We're limited for time, so I wanted to show you something that's sold often as an upside down catfish. But again, it's the eupterus, also called the network catfish because it has a really neat pattern. These guys tend to group together at night. So do all the other small catfish. So at night, if you turn on your aquarium, you'll see them, if you have a pack of them, they'll all be sleeping together in a tight pack. And these guys are great hiders right now, so fortunately you're not gonna get a lot of motion from them. They're also a bit nocturnal. You don't see a lot of feeding from upside down catfish until night. All right, now I'm going to move on to some catfish from Asia. There's a bunch of different Synodontis. Unfortunately, right now I only have a couple in the warehouse I wanted to show. I have a very rare one that came in about the size of my pinky nail on an African shipment. It was just mixed in with a bunch of elephant nose. So we threw it in our big tank to see what would happen. And now it's this beautiful, big, unfortunately blind albino catfish. And I don't know exactly what kind of Codonas it is, but that was exciting. However, it's really hard to bring in catfish from the wild now. You can bring them in from South America because they do a beautiful job of preserving the rainforests down there. But in the rest parts of the world, particularly Asia and Africa, most of the freshwater fish is gone. And so most of those fish we bring in through captive breeding activities. In fact, 75% of all freshwater fish have disappeared from the world since 1970. So that's just a little over 50 years. We've lost 3/4 of all the fish that were in our freshwater environments. So if you want to put more fish in freshwater, get a fish tank and go to your local aquarium store or go to aquariumfishsale.com and get what you need. They'll help you out. The Asian catfish I have right now are nice community fish. One's a nano species called the stone catfish, also called an anchor catfish because you'll see it's shaped like an anchor. And these catfish only grow to 2 inches. There's several other Asian catfish you're going to find. In fact, the largest catfish in the world is called the Mekong giant catfish. That grows to 9 feet. It can swallow a man. There's another catfish that you'll find. You'll find the goonch catfish from time to time in the aquarium trade. That can swallow a kid. And I hardly ever bring that thing in because it's very, very fragile. It's a wild caught fish. It's hard to handle, and the DOA rate, the dead on arrival rate, is just too high for me, I think, to ethically ship that thing around. But all these other catfish I'm showing today are hardy, easy to ship, easy to find in the aquarium stores. The stone catfish. Beautiful little hardy catfish. Like nearly all catfish, they inhabit the bottom area of the fish tank, in the bottom area of the ponds, streams, rivers. They also are temperature tolerant because of that, because the lower you are, obviously in the water, the temperature gradient goes down, so bottom of the water is colder than the top. These guys inhabit the bottom, so they can handle temperatures to the low 70s, but they can't handle temperatures in the mid 80s and up. So discus tanks, Codonas are good with them, but be careful of some of the more fragile catfish in that case. As I said, catfish are bottom dwellers. Normally they're a little lethargic during the day. They'll scamper around all crazy kinds of ways during the night. Upside down catfish will even forage upside down, but during the day you won't see a lot of action from most catfish. And there is one though that happens to inhabit the middle of the tank. It's also one of the few schooling catfish. So before I put it out, can any of you guess what it is? A schooling catfish that inhabits the middle of the fish tank. Wrong. This is the glass catfish, also called the ghost catfish. The glass catfish or ghost catfish grows to 5-6 inches in the aquarium. It's a slow grower. It's a very mild, peaceful fish. It eats flake food, and like I said, it normally schools in the middle of the fish tank, so it's a really nice display. And you can put smaller fish in with this particular species. Now we're going to my favorite group of catfish, catfish from South America. And these guys, there's so many different catfish, from little pygmy catfish. The smallest one in the world, in fact, comes from South America. It's called the Canduru. That's the little one that can, in theory, swim up your little pee-pee place if you go to the bathroom in South America. So I was down there. I definitely watched what I did when I was in the river. It's a myth though. Heiko, anyone who spends a lot of time down in South America will tell you they've never heard of any actual cases of that happening. If you don't know what I'm talking about, look it up. It's not really appropriate for this show. But that's the smallest catfish. It goes up to 4-footers, the red-tailed catfish, which I happen to have one here. So I want to start with a little bumblebee catfish. Bumblebee catfish are definitely nocturnal. You will not see these guys during the day. Fear not, if you turn on the light at night, they will be swimming all over the place. If you get a pack of them, they'll sleep in a pack, like as tight as possible. It's very interesting. These guys, and that's why they're so cheap. They're very affordable catfish because the Indians, when they catch them in South America, just like farluellas and some of the other, and Banjo catfish, some of the other ones I'm gonna show you, tend to hibernate in big, or not really hibernate, but sleep in big packs. And so they're easy to catch. And also because they form big packs, they breed quite a bit, I guess because close proximity and, you know, love the one you're with, whatever. So there's a lot of them. There's a lot of bumblebee catfish. Typically in the pet store, they'll be around $5. They're very pretty, but they need clean water, temperatures no less than 75 degrees. Even though they're cheap, they're actually, catfish is very prone to dying off if you let the ammonia spike in your fish tank or let the water get a little too dirty. As you've seen so far, catfish kind of have a camouflage pattern. They inhabit the bottom of fresh water that has a lot of big predators. Especially when they're small, they have very, very little color to them because they need to stay hidden. One of the best camouflage patterns you'll find in a catfish is from this next one. Can you guess what it is? Wrong. It's the Banjo catfish. And the Banjo catfish is shaped like a piano, a banjo. And these guys just sit at the bottom of your fish tank and they look really, really cool. So I recommend them because they're again, a very affordable catfish like the bumblebee catfish. They're hardier than the bumblebee catfish and they don't hide because they rely on their camouflage. So they'll just sit in the middle of the tank thinking no one can see them. And they are so easy to catch because they play dead because they're trying to think, oh, this guy thinks I'm just a leaf. But he's not. He's a really cool catfish. And remember, when you handle these fish, and they are fun to catch because they're so easy, just remember to lightly handle them, not cover too much of their body surface because that's where the slime coating is. So every fish has a slime coating. You want to protect that as much as possible. So I'm not going to pick them up again, even though I really want to. Again, this is the Banjo catfish. These are full size. This is considered large for a Banjo catfish. The next one I'm going to show you is rarer. It comes from Colombia. It's called the Cabezo de Pelo catfish, but it's easier to just call it the Dwarf Banjo catfish. All right, now what do you feed catfish? I mean, these guys are not going to go up the surface eating flake food. They eat from the bottom. Do you have to drop in algae pellets every week? Not really. They're scavengers. They'll eat the fish food that falls to the bottom that your fish don't eat. Now, unfortunately, also eat fish poop and other things. You want to keep them nice and healthy and thriving. You're not sure if you're just feeding the right amount to your fish. Very few falls to the bottom, which is actually where you want to be. Now, this is the Dwarf Banjo catfish. And it's a great little catfish because this is maximum size. It's not gonna grow any bigger. It can go into a little nano tank like the one on my right. And it can also handle a big aquarium because it's just the right size to go in a nano tank, and it's just the right size to go into a pretty good community fish tank because even a full-size angelfish, he's too big to fit in that angelfish's mouth. So very safe fish for pretty much every aquatic environment. And this is called the Cabezo de Pelo, but in the pet store, you'll see it as the Dwarf Banjo catfish. A little more expensive, maybe $1 or $2 more than the regular Banjo catfish, but a terrific catfish. These next two camouflage catfish from South America are both called whiptail catfish in the trade. They're very different in appearance, but they both have long whiptails. But one's called the long-nosed farluella, and one's called simply the whiptail catfish. So more properly, tiger whiptail catfish. The farluellas, the whiptail catfish, come from a big family of 50 different species. I selected the two most common species. For instance, if the farluella had a long dorsal fin, it would be called the royal farluella. About 5 times more expensive and about 5 times more fragile. I do bring him in from time to time, but the water conditions have to be just right for that guy. If the pH goes over 7.3, 7.4, he's not gonna make it. So you gotta really watch your aquarium water levels for that. These two guys, for that particular species, these two guys are very, very hardy, handle a wide range of temperatures, pH conditions. They're just a little lethargic. So if you're looking for a lot of activity, you're not gonna get them from a whiptail catfish. And if you want the Farlowella or you want the true whiptail, you need to be very specific if you're gonna speak to someone over the phone or order online. In the pet store, obviously, you're gonna see what you get. I prefer the whiptail catfish that we call the Farlowella, long-nosed Farlowella, because of his long nose. I think he's very, very cool. And you can pick him up like a pencil. Children don't try and write with them. They have, just like the sawtooth fish in the ocean, they have a long, flat nose that they use to move debris around so they can get to it with their mouth, which is at the base of that long snout of theirs. So it's a really cool looking fish. Normally does that foraging with that long snout of his at night. All right, now we have the Hoplo catfish. The Hoplo catfish comes from Colombia, and there's different patterns. Some have spots, some don't. The don't ones are called clay Hoplo catfish. This one's a clay Hoplo catfish. If it's a little tannish in color and has some black spots, it's called a spotted Hoplo catfish. These are very affordable catfish, very peaceful. The only thing you can't put in there, again, are probably fancy shrimp. They'll eat those, but otherwise very hardy as well. So a step up from the clay Hoplo cat is the flagtail porthole catfish. As you can see, it has a flagtail very similar to the flagtail portulatus fish. This one has a flagtail with spots on the body. It comes from Brazil. They're fairly expensive. They're usually around $30 in the pet store. There's my missing anchor catfish. Ignore him. We'll get him in a second. But these guys are fairly hardy, not as hardy as the clay Hoplo catfish. These are a wild-caught catfish from Brazil. So right there, that means it's going to be hard to find in the pet store. But not impossible. It has, again, about as pretty colors as you can find. Catfish are generally camouflage patterned fish, and so don't look for great colors. If you want okay colors, this is as good as you're gonna get. This is the flagtail porthole catfish. I know my producer doesn't he doesn't like me talking about history, but I do want to say something about aquaculture. In the 70s, aquaculture was supposed to be the next big thing in agriculture in the United States. And in the 80s, sure enough, quite a few agricultural ponds began opening up. And about that time, tilapia was hybridized to become a very hardy eating fish. And so there were many tilapia as well as salmon and trout and other aquacultural farms in the United States. Then in the 90s, when the world started to become deregulated, aquaculture that was supposed to be a booming business in the United States went overseas because there's no EPA restrictions, labor's almost free, and you can just throw all those chemicals and hormones right in the river. No one's going to say anything. Here in the United States, you can't do that. So most of the aquacultural businesses in the United States went out of business. So nearly everything is farmed now in Asia. And this gets back to the catfish. The tilapia was by far the #1 grown fish species for human consumption and is now the #1 fish for eating in the world. Second, though, is the catfish, primarily hybridized versions of the channel catfish. That's the second most eaten fish in the world and also the second most aquacultured fish in the world. None of these guys are going to be aquacultured. They're just going to be looked at. You can eat them, but it's very, very expensive. Okay, we don't have the Mekong giant catfish or the goonch catfish from Asia, so no one's going to get eaten today. But we do have two catfish that grow quite large from South America. The first one I'm going to show is, and both these now are aquacultured. This is called the tiger shovelnose catfish. And this is a typical size that we import them from Indonesia and that is, I call that a 3-inch catfish. These guys will grow to 3 feet. This is a very nice specimen of Pseudoplastosoma catfish. They have been hybridized with red-tailed catfish. I don't particularly like that one. This is a true wild version, but tank raised of the shovelnose, tiger shovelnose catfish. The tiger shovelnose is called that because we have a tiger stripe pattern on the fins, not so much on the body. And the mouth has a big, wide mouth, so it's like a shovel. So he's a He's a shovelnose. And as he gets big, remember, anything that can fit in any fish's mouth will get consumed. So this guy is great for things like cichlid tanks, big size community tanks, but not for smaller community fish tanks. Now the last catfish is in a family that we would call monster catfish or monster fish. And you can find monster fish if you put it in as a for sale in many places like Aquabids, aquariumfishsale.com. So there's a bunch of them that sell monster fish. Monster fish generally outgrow standard aquariums. So be cautious, have a game plan. Here's one definitely that becomes a monster fish. This is the red-tailed catfish. And he will grow 3 feet. In the wild, these guys can grow up to 4 feet. But in the fish tank, these guys are gonna grow big. When they're a foot, they really start displaying their bright red tail. At this size, because he's small, he doesn't wanna get eaten. The small guys evolve with starting with no color, swimming around so someone doesn't grab them. But as he gets bigger, that big red tail starts to display itself. This is a fairly hardy catfish. He doesn't tolerate pH above 7.2 very well at all. He does need warm water. Anything under 75 will be detrimental to his health. And watch medication with catfish. They don't have scales, so you need half doses when you medicate catfish compared to fish with scales. And there should be other precautions on a well-labeled fish medicine bottle. So catfish have a reputation of being tough. They can live in mud, not really so in the aquatic environment. Make sure you have clean water, no ammonia spikes. I want to conclude the show with this beautiful red-tailed catfish and also conclude it with the thought that never let that ammonia spike in the fish tank. It's going to be very detrimental, particularly to bottom feeders, especially fish without scales. And most of these catfish we've gone through today have no scales whatsoever. Also medication, be very cautious with those. So if you want to practice exercising caution, get an aquarium. Any of these catfish, particularly the small catfish, they'll go right in the tank just like this. Not so with this tank with the red-tailed catfish and tiger shovelnose. Just get something big. They're gonna get big within a year. And by big, they're not gonna get 3 feet, but they're gonna get 6 inches, 7 inches. So if you want any of these fish, go to your local pet store. If they don't have them, forget about Petco and PetSmart. They don't do special orders. But the other guys, the real guys that really know their fish, ask them to just order and they'll find them from one of us, the wholesalers. We can get them to them. Or go to aquariumfish.com. And please subscribe to the show, enjoy your aquarium, and we can't wait to see you for the next episode.